Hello, everyone.
Hi again. We're in Crisis of Conscience, the chapter Credentials and Cause, where it's in the late 50s now. Ray Franz is obeying the Society's policy of the day, which means anybody who works in any kind of headquarters or branch office, as Ray was doing, is not permitted yet to get married. That changes now. He says later the Society changed its policy on marriage, and 13 years after arriving in Puerto Rico, I married Cynthia, my wife, and she joined me in traveling work. So this would be now 1959. Economic conditions in the islands were poor, considerably beneath today's level. We lived with the people we served, sharing their little homes, sometimes with running water and electricity, sometimes not, sometimes with a measure of privacy, often with very little. Relatively young, we adjusted, though my wife's health was due to be seriously affected. Only a few months after our marriage, while serving in a small island, my wife fell ill with a severe case of gastroenteritis, evidently from bad water or tainted food. The home we were staying in belonged to a fine West Indian couple with lovable children. Unfortunately, the house they were renting was overrun with roaches, a creature that inspires near panic in my wife. At night, we regularly checked our bed for any roaches before letting the mosquito netting down. Suspecting that a large box in a corner containing clothes was the creature's headquarters, one day I took some insect spray and went to the box, lifted the top garment. I quickly let it down, for the box was alive with what looked to be hundreds of small roaches, and I feared the spray could send them everywhere. For added measure, a large rat each night entered the kitchen next to our room and next to the only bathroom, its size being enough to make the tins of food on the shelves move.
They are saints. I couldn't live in that condition. In these circumstances, my wife now began to experience the gastroenteritis, developing extreme diarrhea, and regular vomiting. I was able to get her to the island's one doctor, and an injection temporarily stopped the vomiting. Late that night it began again, and this, coupled with the constant diarrhea, brought Cynthia to the point of dehydration. I ran about a mile to rouse the doctor from sleep, and we carried her in his jeep to a little clinic. Her veins had nearly collapsed, and the nurses tried again and again before they could finally get a needle in to administer saline solution. She was able to leave a few days afterward, but her health was never quite the same. A later parasite infection, whipworm, added to the problem. We continued in traveling work until 1961, and then were transferred to the Dominican Republic. Trujillo was assassinated shortly before our arrival.
That was the leader of the Dominican Republic, as it's now called, Santo Domingo back then. During our nearly 5 years there, we saw the fall of 4 separate governments, and in April 1965 experienced a war that centered around the capital where we were located. Most Americans and other foreign residents fled the country. Our missionary group felt no inclination to abandon the Dominican Jehovah's Witnesses in our assignment, and so we learned what wartime life is like. Nights were filled with the crack of hundreds of rifles, the rattle of machine guns, the boom of bazookas, and other heavier weapons. Lulls came in the fighting during the day, and we were able to get outside and carry on some activity, though sometimes almost pinned down by the eruption of gunfire. To this day, I have wondered just how close bullets must come for the distinct buzzing sound like that of angry bees to be heard as they fly past your head. One soldier comfortingly told me, "There's no need to worry about those. You won't hear the one that hits you."
My goodness. The remaining 15 years of full-time service were quite different, as they were spent at the international headquarters in Brooklyn, New York. My reason for describing in some detail the earlier years up to 1965 is that their content seems to be more of the fabric, though greatly inferior in quality, of the experiences the apostle focused on in setting forth the evidence of the genuineness of his service to God and Christ, saying, "We prove we are servants of God by great fortitude in times of suffering, in times of hardship and distress." In the words that follow, he makes no mention of his speeches, gives no figures of his great audiences he addressed, cites no examples of organizational feats in building up large numbers of believers. That was, he was referring to 2 Corinthians 6, 4-20 in the Jerusalem Bible. "I make no claim that what I went through was any more than what many others have experienced, either as missionaries of Jehovah's Witnesses or of other religions. The record is simply set out for the reader to decide upon its relative worth, particularly as regards assessing the validity and integrity of the information supplied in the rest of this publication." It was a very wise decision, I would say, on his part. But you know what struck me, or what I thought of, was when he leaves years later, he's described as, like all ex-witnesses who leave are described, as proud and selfish and lazy, not wanting to do the work. Really, you think he'd wait until that long before he decided he wasn't sincere about this and he didn't believe it? I don't think a person would live like this and make those kinds of sacrifices if he wasn't sincere. And now we say he had a bad heart.
But this is when you look at the whole history, you realize that pattern that would vilify a man like Ray Franz and his wife Cynthia, and all the others that have left for honest-hearted reasons, that you then call having a wicked heart, or even being disloyal to Jehovah.
Yeah.
Which is not what you say about Christendom, or you save your worst vitriol for people like him because, Rutherford did it, didn't he, in the 1920s when the Russellites were making a fuss because he was changing Russell's teachings while still calling him the faithful and discreet slave or wise servant. Even then, it was, no, they must have the wrong heart condition.
Yeah, they don't think the way we do, so they must be wicked-hearted.
So I also have to say something about the sacrifices, though, because this is the kind of stuff, when you read the positive reports, let's say in the Proclaimer's book or the older books, about missionaries overseas or about what the brothers in different countries put up with, you realize this is one of their badges, as if this is only happening to us.
Yeah.
When you realize, if you've been in the book business like we have, there's all kinds of books out there about what Christians have gone through, as he acknowledges here.
It is not unique to Jehovah's Witnesses, and you would, even if you're not saying it, or you are thinking it in a way, because you've been kind of trained to think we're so unique and our suffering is us against the world. But when you do read, which I didn't do until I left the Witnesses, start reading some of the stories of the missionaries and the kinds of things, it reminds you of these stories, because they endure different things depending on where they are, suffering cold or heat or...
But frankly, it's worse, because here at least they don't suffer unto death. And that's true of, basically all the leaders of the organization over the 140 years. None of them have been martyrs. Yes, local witnesses have been martyrs, that's for sure. But the point of difference is that Christians have been enduring this kind of stuff for 2,000 years, and a lot worse. And yet all of it, and I would say that to our sacrifices too, if they're not done for the sake of the good news, they're not done to God. So we could think of the Old Testament where even his own people are offering sacrifices to Molech and to Baal. They're not meritorious in themselves. It's only when the truth is being upheld, and the Watchtower doesn't have the good news, so the truth is not being upheld. So all these sacrifices end up being in vain.
So Israel would sacrifice to Jehovah, and then they would also sacrifice to the pagan gods.
Yeah.
Somehow thinking that this was proof of something.
That you've got yourself completely covered then, right?
Yeah.
You've blessed all the gods and they're obligated to you. Well, that's
Yeah.
the way we think as Jehovah's Witnesses. We've done all of this.
Mm.
God has to be pleased. Well, he's not if it's all for the sake of another gospel.
Mm.
What was our link? Or would you want me to read my own writing?
Yeah, it's your writing, so maybe. I think it's what
JW.org is not telling you about the good news. So it's on this very subject. Well, 1 Corinthians 15, 1-5, good news, is
Right.
different than our good news. And then also on the website, we've got a PDF file called JW Structure, Jehovah's Witnesses Structure of Authority, comparing both the doctrines of JWs in respect to Christendom's doctrines and also the way they set up their authority structure.
Mm.
So check that document out. We haven't used it enough on the channel, but
Yeah.
it does kind of make vivid what the difference is between the Watchtower Good News and the Witnesses Good News.
by a drawing, so that think of them as two types of buildings, really.
Yeah, and if you want
Yeah.
permission to use that in Sunday school or some
Yeah,
other function,
certainly.
go ahead, because it does work.
Yeah, I used it.
See you soon.